Welcome back to the Shepherd's Pie, a slice of faith for our messy lives. I'm Tony Kolenc, a speaker, law professor, and the author of inspirational fiction for teens and adults. On that note, the second book in my Incarnate series by Chrism Press, it's called Begotten, and it follows the story of a young man who is a natural end of times novel for adult readers. But today, I'll be speaking with Carmela Martino about writing fiction with history. My guest today is Carmela Martino, an author, speaker, and writing teacher. She holds an MFA in writing, and she taught college writing classes for over 20 years. Her articles, poetry, and short stories have been published in newspapers, magazines, and various anthologies. She's also the author of two award-winning novels, the middle grade novel, Rosa Sola, based on her experiences growing up in an Italian immigrant family, and the novel that we're going to focus on today, which is her young adult historical romance called Playing by Heart, which was inspired by two amazing sisters who lived in 18th century Milan. That book has been recently re-released with new materials, and Carmela will tell us about that. So Carmela, welcome back to the Shepherd's Pie.
Hi, Tony. It's great to talk to you again.
Yeah, so it's been a while actually since you've been on the show. So I know you've had a lot going on in your life. So maybe kind of
Seen more on poetry the last few years. I've had some poems in various anthologies and magazines. Unfortunately, the original publisher of Playing by Heart went out of business, left us authors all stranded, but they gave us our rights back. So I decided to re-release Playing by Heart. I always had wanted to have discussion questions included with the novel because I find that they're very valuable for readers. And so I spent a good part of 25 working on the cover, updated a little so it'd be easier to tell the difference between the new and the original edition, and then a separate teacher's guide that's downloadable from my website. So the discussion questions could be used in a book club or by a classroom teacher or homeschool teacher, but the teacher's guide has additional activities specifically for homeschooling or teachers' uses.
one thing that some people might be curious about is we don't know what happens to authors and their materials when a publisher goes out of business. Can you maybe take a minute or two and just kind of explain what was that process like for those aspiring authors out there? What might they want to know based on your experience with that?
As an aspiring author, if you do sign with a traditional publisher, you want to make sure you have a clause in your contract that says you get the rights back to the book if the publisher goes out of business. So that way you can either have another publisher republish the book, or you could self-publish it, which is what I chose to do. Your rights back for the text, but then you need to have a new cover made. We were given our cover rights back. I changed mine a little. It's still very recognizable, but it has slight differences.
You know, I wonder almost if this is an opportunity for authors when something like this happens, because I know everybody else's stuff and soon years and years have gone by and your book is on some backlist. Did you feel like this sort of gave you an opportunity to sort of revive the book again, make it fresh?
Yeah, actually it did. Because I added the discussion questions, I made some tweaks. I could call it an updated edition, so it's not the same. An updated edition, so it's not the same as the original. So it has a new copyright date of 2025, and as a result, it got added to some lists of new books came out in 2025, even though it's been out before. So it does breathe a little extra life into a story. The book already won numerous awards, but if it hadn't, I could even have submitted it for awards because it would be considered a new book with a 2025 copyright date. And hopefully, I am hoping to connect with new readers, people that may not have heard about it when it came out the first time. As you said, it ends up on the backlist and people forget getting to talk about it again. So that can be an advantage if you're willing to do the work. But another thing that can happen is the publisher chooses not to publish your book anymore if the sales reach below a certain threshold. And again, if you're an aspiring writer, when you get a contract, you want to make sure those thresholds are defined so that you don't have a book out there that's not selling. And when the publisher isn't promoting your book and it's not making enough sales, you want your rights back. And so that was in my clause in my first contract with Rosa Sola. So I got the rights back because of that in that case, and I'll publish that book on my own. So I actually have two books now that I have self-published, which is convenient because then, you create up a publishing company. So you have to do that anyway. So now I have a second book out with that publishing company.
All right. So tell us then about the premise of Playing by Heart.
Playing by Heart, as you mentioned, summary is basically that Amelia Salvini lives in 18th century Milan, a time and a place where there are only two options for upper class girls, either marriage or going to the convent. She hopes for marriage. She's a musician. She loves music, and she hopes to marry a man who loves music as she does and will allow her to continue. Creating music, studying music. But she overhears a conversation between her parents talking about possible marriage plans for her older sister, and fears that because each child has to have a dowry when they are married, fears that they will send her to a convent instead because the dowry is less for a convent than for marriage. So she also knows that her father, this is a time of the Enlightenment, and her father is in the upper class and he likes to impress other people, and she help her father in his attempt to rise in society, that he will allow her to marry. He will arrange for marriage. But before she can do that, she has to convince her music tutor to help her. And he is not very fond of her because he looks down on her because she's female. Very few women were taught it was unusual for her to be a student. So first she's got to win over her music tutor that she is capable of the kinds of things she wants to do. And this is inspired by a woman who was born in Milan in the 1700s and who was a musician and had an older sister. She was a linguist who was a musician and had an older sister. She was a linguist first. She spoke 7 different languages, some people say by age 11, and she became a mathematician. And she wanted to become a nun. She was very devoutly Catholic, but her father liked having her to raise a piece. And so he did not allow her to become a nun. She needed his permission to do that. But after he died, the elder sister character in real life ended up devoting the rest of her life to helping the poor and became sort of the Mother Teresa of Milan. And the younger sister married the man she was in love with. His stories are inspired by the two sisters, but there's enough differences that I didn't use their real names in the book itself.
And how did you come across the story of these sisters, and what was it about their story? I know as a novelist, you can write about just about anything, and there's an endless number of topics that I often think, well, that would be cool to write a book about that, but we all know it takes a lot out of us to write a book. So what was it about their story? How'd you learn about it that really resonated enough with you that you were ready to do that?
I actually have an undergraduate degree in math and computer science. I learned about Gaetana Agnesi. I learned about her a few years back when I read an article about little-known women of history, and I was appalled because here was this Italian mathematician who she was well known for writing the first book that covered everything from basic math to calculus, because calculus was relatively new at that time. This book was award-winning, acknowledged book, and I had never heard of her, and I had a degree in math and computer science, and she could have been a role model, plus she was Italian, as I am Italian. So I was really upset that I'd never heard about her, and I set out to write a biography about her, which I'm still hoping to sell one day, which I haven't sold yet, a biography for young readers. But in the process, I was intrigued by, I learned about the younger sister and the relationship and how the father actually used the daughters to advance his status in society. And I kept thinking about how in the footsteps, to follow footsteps of her older sister, who was so accomplished. As I said, she spoke 7 languages. This was a time when the father had salons in his home where people came and talked about the latest scientific developments, and the older sister would lecture on what she was learning, and the younger sister was there performing music on the about how it felt to be manipulated by them and how it must have felt to be a woman at that time with limited background. Yet these women, limited opportunities, I should say, yet these women were given opportunities that most women never could have imagined. The older one studying math and philosophy, and the younger composing philosophy, and the younger composing music. She was one of the first women to compose a serious opera. So I just was fascinated by their lives and the challenges they must have faced, and that inspired me to write the story.
Now, this is billed as a historical romance. So I'm assuming at some point, there's a guy in this story and there's a romance that's going to develop. So maybe talk to that for a minute or two. And especially writing for a Christian, author, Christian audience, how did you bring the romance into this and make it something that wouldn't be, like a Harlequin romance or something where you've got here?
I set out to write something in the vein of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. That's one of my favorite books. And I was very complimented when a couple of people who read Playing by Heart, called it an Italian Pride and Prejudice. So I decided to create misunderstandings between the lead male character and the main character, Amelia, so that at first it's sort of like enemies to romantic partners transition. And because of the Catholic upbringing of these girls, it is very clean romance. They don't even hold hands until I think the very ending. In fact, I had a recent review that was disappointed they didn't kiss, So, but that was a choice I made, partly because they were devout Catholics. I also was inspired because I knew in real life the character who the story is based on wanted to marry a man who was poor, and her father would not give her permission to marry. So I knew she had a love interest in real life, who she does eventually marry him, but only after her father dies. So, and again, I also wanted to use the romance as a way to help not only young women, but adult women today better appreciate how difficult it was for women in the past. Options, a convent life or marriage. And it was typically the father who decided what option would be taken. And also, if you married, what husband you would have. So I wanted to show what that must have been like for women at that time to help us modern women better appreciate the opportunities we have today.
Wow. So, and everything that you've been saying, which is fascinating, reminds me of how much you can actually learn from reading a novel. Here you've got a historical romance, but it could be just about any novel, I suppose. So maybe talk to that because people love to reading experience.
Well, I think historical fiction in particular, whether it's romance or not, provides the opportunity to learn history in an interesting way. And so when I wrote the novel, I set out to incorporate as many real people, places, and events as I could into the story. So that's why my main characters are inspired by real sisters. But it doesn't end there. And I have real places. I looked at sketches and drawings of the real places, some of them, the Opera House, which was before the current Milan Opera House, which is very famous, but the prior Opera House, which is very famous, but the prior Opera House burnt down, and that's why they had to build the current one. So that is in there. And when the Archduchess visits Milan, she participates in a ceremony, the ritual of the Holy Nail, which happened twice a year, but now it only happens once a year, still happening today. So I incorporate as many of those things as I could find into the story so that as people are reading, yes, they're just kind of, for some people, just background information or setting details, but in a way you're subconsciously learning about how people did things then and the role of the church at that time. All these little bits and pieces that I find fascinating when I read historical fiction are incorporated in the story. And even if you're not a history buff, you can learn in a way subconsciously about what life was like at that time and place.
And I have the Harwood Mysteries out. I have the Harwood Mysteries out from Loyola Press, which is my teen fiction series that is in 1180s. in England. And I can just hearing you talk about how you were researching, I don't know that people appreciate sometimes the smallest details that probably might not even factor into anything in your story except just being a setting piece or a person who comes through. I know for me, there was just so many times where I spent so much effort just getting some detail together. When you put together the kind of historical novel that you put together, there's a lot easier these days because of the internet and, AI or whatever, but there's a lot of work that goes into getting those details right. So now you came up with these discussion questions. What kinds of questions are these? Are these the kinds of questions that people are learning about history with, or are they other types of focal points?
My novel are not so much about the history, they're more about the characters. One of the questions that I have is asking readers, how do you think life would be for those characters if they lived today? How would their lives be different? And also, if you lived at that time, how would you have responded to the events that happened in these girls' lives? Would you have behaved the way they have behaved? I also ask about, what were your assumptions going into reading this story? What did you assume women were allowed to do at that time, or what their lives were like? And did you learn anything? Were you surprised by what you learned, or did it challenge the assumptions that you had going in? And that learned, or did it challenge the assumptions that you had going in? And that gets people reflecting about how we have assumptions about life in the past. And I have to say, Tony, I can't imagine the research you did, because you're talking farther back than my story. Your Harwood mysteries, I think researching those would have been really hard. I had enough difficulty. For the farther back you go, the more difficult it is, because we have fewer resources to fall back on. And as you said, I would spend like finding out what they ate, because I wanted to include, scenes around the table. You can't have a novel set in Italy without food. And I didn't know what they ate. I spent say they ate. Were children allowed at the table with their parents? I mean, these are kind of obscure things, but I was always worried that somebody who knew the answer would read my book and say, "Oh, she got it wrong." So far nobody said that. So I'm glad. I'm kind of relieved. So yeah, my questions aren't so much about history. I think we absorb the history as we read, and then when we reflect on the questions, that may get us thinking also more about the history. Now, what I also do is I provide resources on my website for additional information. I have an author's note that talks about the women who inspired the real story. With the new edition, I'm hoping to appeal to book clubs. I would love to talk to book clubs or homeschool groups or classrooms about the real sisters who inspired the novel and what their lives were like. And so I have a book club page on my website with links to, for example, you can listen to the compositions being played. For example, you can listen to the compositions being played today of the woman who inspired the role of Amelia. They've lost a number of her compositions, but they still have some of the music she composed. And there are modern groups who are recording that, and some of that you can listen to online on YouTube. So I have links to things like that. So people who are interested in the history or learning more about the characters and the background can, through the resources I give them.
Wow. Yeah, no, that sounds great. And you're right. In the 12th century, there actually are a surprisingly good number of resources, but of course, none of them would be in any language that we could read today. But yeah, it's a professor at Catholic University who specialized in 12th century monastic life in England, because no matter how much research I did, there were still details that just were really not attainable without kind of like some really specialized skills. So was there anybody that you wound up appealing to, or what was the methods that you wound up appealing to, or what was the methods that you used to be able to really find the history you needed to find?
Yes, I was very fortunate. I had something similar. You think it's obscure, but I found a professor who was a professor of 16th and 17th century and 18th century Italian music to be at the University of Chicago, and I live outside Chicago. And he was very gracious with his time. I arranged a phone interview with him, and he was so helpful, because there are things, like you say, you can't find in history books. Even with the internet, you can't find certain things. And I found him because he had written an article about the music of that. I found him because he had written an article about the music of that era. And actually, I think, yeah, he also wrote an article about one of the pieces composed by the woman who inspired the main character in my novel. So I've contacted him and he was very generous. And at that point, I'd already had some plot ideas. And my thing was, I don't mind inventing something for my story as long as it's plausible. One of my questions for him was that the Archduchess in real life had visited Milan during the time period of my story. And I wanted to have the professor. I said, is it plausible that the two would have met? And he said, not only is it plausible, he says, I think it's very likely that they met. And so I was very happy to hear that. So I could have that scene in my story and feel that it was a believable scene. It wasn't just made up. And also, he also helped me because professor who taught her how to compose and play music, and nobody knows who it was in real life. Nobody knows who could have taught her music. However, there's speculation about several different prominent composers of that time. I had again asked this music professor if it could have been one particular. There's speculation about several different prominent composers of that time. I had again asked this music professor if it could have been one particular composer I had researched. And he said, yeah, that is a possibility that he could have been her teacher. So then I based that character on that person in real life, even though I never have a model for the character that I'm writing about.
Yeah, and talk about paying it forward. It is so nice to have people who are willing to give of their time. The other thing you just said that struck a chord with me was I also like writing almost like the exceptions to the rule. My theory on this is as I'm coming up with the exceptions to the rule, like this isn't maybe how it always went, but you talk about how it always was supposed to go, and the fact that it didn't go the way it's supposed to go is notable. That's what sometimes would make something more interesting. I kind of feel like you're learning the history there too, even though you might have some of your discussion questions where you're almost putting modern people to try to put themselves in the shoes of people of different cultures and times where we might not even be able to fathom what it would be like for me in my books, like living in the Middle Ages where
Yeah,
you talk about
yeah,
limited choices. My like living in the Middle Ages where
yeah,
you talk about
yeah.
limited choices. My characters are mostly like peasants. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, is it even possible for us to truly be able to say, well, what would I do if I were like that? Because I would have had to have been so steeped in the culture, the history, and just the way everybody would have thought at that time.
I agree with you. It's really hard. And again, the farther back we go, I think the harder it is because life was that much more different. That's one of the issues I have with some fiction, especially for young readers that have these women characters that are so independent. I like to do. I have no problem with it. But I know there's historical fiction out there that's not inspired by real people that somebody invented, which I think is wonderful. Except that, is it realistic for somebody raised in a certain time period who is indoctrinated from birth to believe certain things that their world is shaped a certain way, to have these outrageous ideas that break all barriers? I have a problem with that because it's really hard for us to imagine what it would have been like to have been born in that society, in that culture. I think the more we read, the more we're able to imagine, especially if we read well-written, it creates empathy and other things, but it helps us to try to imagine and stretch our imaginations to what it might have been like. I don't know how accurate that is. I think it's a great exercise, whether how close we get to what it really was. I'm not sure it matters if we don't get close to what really was. I think just the process of trying to imagine is a good. And that's what I think we do with historical fiction. We kind of let the reader live that life vicariously and try to imagine how they would have survived and whether they could have thrived in that kind of atmosphere.
Yeah, no, you're right. There are so many challenges, and the one that I struggled with, especially in the Harvard Mysteries one, was on the one hand not having characters who are totally anachronistic, so that you're like, there's no way a character would ever do or think this. But on the other hand, to have a character that would be relatable to a modern person, especially modern youth, I kind of feel like because it's historical fiction, there is a little bit of license, I think, for the author. There may be some things you're like, well, yeah, that may be a stretch that somebody might have thought like this, but somebody would be able to relate to it a lot more right now, especially, a younger person. But yeah, no, that was something I struggled with myself, because I'm probably in her, way of thinking than the typical girl would have been at the time.
Well, I read it and I thought she was believable. I mean, you can have, and it is realistic to have some people who don't fit the mold. There's always people in every society and culture who don't quite fit the mold, and I don't have a problem with that as long as in culture who don't quite fit the mold, and I don't have a problem with that as long as it's done within that culture and it fits the story. And I think in your books it does. I never felt out of place to me in your story, whereas I have read the other books where it did feel out of place. So
I appreciate you saying that. Actually,
yeah,
yeah, it's
yeah.
right. I forgot
But I think that's
that you know
maybe
those stories. It's
yeah.
right. I forgot
But I think that's
that you know
maybe
those stories.
some of the value of like these supplemental materials. Like I know Loyola's provided some great materials to go with your books to really inspire readers to think about those kinds of things and what it might have been like. And the thing I keep coming back to also is I talk about in some of the questions about we are human no matter what era we lived in. We still struggle with the same emotions. We still have fear, which is one of the motives for one of my characters. And we also have jealousy, which is one of the motives I felt my character was jealous of her sister. And so there's some sibling rivalry going on. So that even though my story was about characters in the 1700s, young people in the 2000s can definitely relate still to being sibling rivalry or having their parents push them into something that they don't want. We still do that to our children today, parents. So I try to pick up on that, the parts of our humanity that doesn't change with time.
Yeah, absolutely, right. There's nothing new under the sun. King Solomon saying that in the Old Testament,
Mm-hmm.
and human nature really hasn't changed. So, if folks want to get a hold of this new edition of Playing by Heart, or the new Rosa Sola, learn more about you, where should they go?
Well, probably the easiest is to go to my website, carmelamartino.com, which is just one L in Carmela. And I have links there. I have more background on both novels and links to where you can purchase them basically wherever books are sold. The book is available basically wherever books are sold. The book is available both in paperback and ebook. And if God wants it, maybe someday as audiobook too, but we're not there yet.
Well, wonderful. Well, it has been so great talking to you again, and I'm so glad that the books are back out there. It's been wonderful having you back on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for the show today. We've been speaking with Carmela Martino about her novel, Playing by Heart, and about writing fiction with history. This is, again, Antony Barone Kolenc. If you want to learn more about my books or school group, go to my website, antonykolenc.com. But until next time, may God bless us as we rely on our faith to work through the messy challenges of our lives.